Hey, so I'd like to show you a few ways you can decrease the amount of artifacts in your Blender 5.0 renders. So I'll split this into three parts. First, I'll show you two settings you want to make sure to enable or disable depending on your scene. Then I'll show you a technique you can use to speed up your rendering like twice, and also it will decrease the amount of artifacts a lot. And the third part, I will basically walk you through all my settings and workflow for setting up your render for like Instagram Reels and TikToks. So let me first show you those two settings I mentioned. So the first one, which we got in Blender 5.0, is this under render and volume. You have this biased checkbox. By default, it's disabled, and I would actually, for most renders, suggest you to keep it disabled. However, there are some cases you will want to enable this. So if your render is like lit from like the sky texture or an HDRI, you're gonna want to keep it disabled. And if your like render is mostly lit by an area light or like spotlight, you're gonna want to enable this. So let me show you an example of this enabled or disabled. So in this render, you can see this is with checkbox enabled. You can see like there's a lot of artifacts, and if you go to this render, you can see it's much smoother. Now if I disable the noise, I mean if the denoising, you can see in the noise how this noise is really fine. And in this, I don't even know what this is. Okay, that's terrible. So for this type of render, you're definitely want to make sure to keep this disabled. Okay, and here we got this render. Okay, so in this render, which is mostly like area light lit, and also there's a lot of these image planes, I found that keeping the checkbox enabled here actually helps a little bit. So this is with it disabled. You see how this noise is really like big, and yeah, it's ugly. And when you enable the checkbox, you see how much fine the noise is. And the same goes for this area right here. So you can see how with the checkbox enabled, the grain is much finer than with it disabled. So yeah, you're gonna have to test a little bit for different types of renders, but yeah, the general rule I found is it's best to keep it disabled if your scene is like sky texture lit, and enable it if your scene is like area light or spotlight lit. Okay, so the next thing you're gonna want to disable is noise threshold. Now I couldn't really find the example right now, but I had a lot of cases where I would enable noise threshold and Blender's denoiser just did not know what to do with the image. It completely freaked out, and I had all artifacts all over the place. You can use noise threshold if you're not going to denoise the render with Blender's denoiser, but if you are going to, I would definitely suggest you to turn it off. Now I'd like to show you this technique I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So what I was talking about is called frame interpolation. This is going to work on animated renders which have like slow movement. Let's say just this slow camera movement, and it's not really gonna work if you have anything fast moving in the frame, like if a car was speeding by or a person moving a lot or something. So just keep that in mind. This can actually increase the amount of artifacts if there's a lot of movement, but for slow renders like this, it's perfect. So you're gonna need a second program for this. You can use DaVinci Resolve, Premiere, or After Effects. I'll go ahead and show you how to do it in After Effects just because that's what I use. So let me first show you how this render looks before. So yeah, you can see the amount of artifacts right here, how like bad this looks. And if you go back into Blender and you increase this step number to like 2, Blender is going to render every second frame. Just make sure if you have an even number of frames to render the last frame manually, because usually it's gonna start from 1, and as it's going 1, 3, 5, 7, it's gonna end on an odd number, so you have to render the last even number manually. Okay, so when you got that rendered, let me just delete this. You're going to import it into After Effects. So you see you have like 1, 3, 5. You're going to select the first image and import the image sequence. Now After Effects is gonna warn us we have missing frames, but that's okay. And make sure your frame rate is set correctly. Now you're going to drag and drop it onto your timeline. So what you're going to want to do is go here into the time and time stretch, and here you're going to divide this 100 number by the same number you put into the step rate in Blender. So once we have this, we'll have to export it. I will suggest you to export this into QuickTime Apple ProRes 422. This format is great for keeping all your like data in video, so it's not compressed. And just export this somewhere where you want. And after it's exported, we can just go and make a new project. You do not have to save this. You're going to want to import the video we just exported, and you can just like drag and drop it onto the timeline. Here you're going to want to increase the duration of your timeline by twice again, and you're going to time stretch this now, not divide, but times the same steps number. This is going to bring video back to its original speed, but we no longer have missing frames. Now you're going to enable this like frame interpolation button, and After Effects is going to interpolate every second frame, which will reduce the amount of artifacts. Now you can see this looks slightly better. If you are unhappy with the results you got from frame interpolation, you can just go back in Blender and increase the start frame by 1. And now you can re-render your scene, but Blender is going to render only the frames it didn't render the first time. So there's like nothing to lose. You just get to try if frame interpolation will work fine, and if it's not, you can just re-render the rest of your scene natively. So yeah. Okay, so now that I showed you those two like settings you want to pay attention to and this technique, I'd like to show you like the rest of my settings I use for my reels. So I have this freshly opened Blender file, and I know many of you already know this, but you're going to set your rendering device correctly. So you use CUDA if you have an older NVIDIA GPU like GTX 10 or 16 series, Optix if you have an RTX card, HIP if you have AMD, and OneAPI if you have Intel. Also make sure to only select the GPU here, not the CPU as well, because when you select both, they have to communicate while rendering, and the link between them is quite slow. So it's often faster to have all the data, I don't know, into the only on the GPU, because yeah, when it does not have to communicate with the CPU, it can render faster. Also, this Vulkan backend, which we also recently got, you can try to have it enabled. It's not going to change your render times, but it can change your viewport performance. I find that it sometimes helps and sometimes it's worse than OpenGL. Also, it has a few bugs. So okay, when that's set, we're going to choose your resolution. I see a lot of people recently rendering in full HD and upscaling their renders, and they got really great results. I have not tried that yet, but yeah, that's something you could try. The way I do it though is I keep my rendering resolution in 4K. Why? A while ago I did some testing when I was increasing the resolution and decreasing samples to keep the same render time. And I found out that at around 4K was the best resolution to get the best results at the same render time. So if you go down to like full HD, I find that Blender denoiser does not have enough data to like denoise artifact free, and if you go above 4K, it's not really worth it. It's just going to increase your file sizes and render time. Now by default I have samples set to 256. However, I rarely go above 128. Even you could even try going to 64. Yeah, for most of my final renders I'll stick to 128 because I find like for reels that's really enough. Now for the denoising, you're always gonna want to choose Open Image Denoise. Up until Blender 4.1, optics made some sense because it was GPU accelerated while Open Image Denoise was not. So optics was like 10 times faster. However, now Open Image Denoise got GPU accelerated and it's actually better quality and maybe even faster than optics. So yeah, just keep it on Open Image Denoise forever. Those are like default settings for it, which are the best accuracy. Now, light tree. I heard disabling light tree can decrease the amount of artifacts. However, I find that to not be really true. I would suggest you to keep it enabled. Here, also I heard on YouTube an advice to enable this clock, but I'm not really sure that's true because what this is going to do is animate your noise in your renders, but when it's animated I just find it to be like more noticeable, so yeah, I would suggest you to keep it disabled. Now on light paths, I keep this mostly by default. Sometimes I'll increase the volume to 1 or 2. Also caustics, I would disable them because you're rarely going to use them in your renders and they just increase the render time. Here is this volume which I talked about earlier. Okay, so this is another important one if you're rendering animated renders. Persistent data. So you know this period when you press render and before like samples start to count, there's this period where something is loading. So if you enable persistent data, the computer is actually going to remember what it calculated before samples started to count, and it's going to reuse that for the next frame. So you can save some time on these calculations before rendering each frame. Also there's this color management, which I always keep a default. Some people like to increase the contrast, I keep it by default. Maybe sometimes I increase the exposure depending on the scene if I think it's too dark, but that's mostly it. Also, I would suggest you to use 16-bit PNGs because they are not really that much compressed. Some people like to use OpenEXR because it has like infinite dynamic range. However, when you use OpenEXR, this color management tab is being ignored. So your AGX view transform is not being applied and it's going back to standard, which looks really bad. So like OpenEXR is great for more advanced workflows, but if you're just trying to make Instagram Reels, I would suggest you to use 16-bit PNGs. Okay, when you have your scene rendered, we're going to After Effects, where I do like most of my color corrections and stuff. But there's a trick I would like to show you here. So remember how we rendered in 4K? For my final render from After Effects, I would actually suggest you to downscale it back to Full HD. Now, why do I do this? When you upload your video to Instagram or TikTok, those platforms will actually process your video again back to Full HD anyways. So you may think it does not matter, it will just downscale it anyways. However, I like to minimize the amount of processing those platforms do to my video. And that's because they often decrease the bitrate a lot as well. So you know how when you go to export and you have this bitrate slider, I usually keep it at 20, which is enough for Full HD. However, you know those like blocky artifacts you get on your video when the compression is high? Yeah, so this number of 20 may be enough for Full HD, but when you have 4K, that's literally 4 times the pixels stored in a video, and that amount of data needs more room to be stored, so you have to increase this number. So I'd like you to think about this bitrate slider as of a box. And let's say a box of 20 centimeters is enough for the program to store a video with a resolution of Full HD. However, if you increase the resolution to 4K, there's 4 times the pixels you have to store in this small 20 centimeters box. So it gets compressed 4 times as much. That's when you get those blocky artifacts. So yeah, you could technically increase this number if you want to export at 4K, but yeah, Instagram is going to compress it back. So I would like to, as I said, minimize the amount of processing Instagram does. So I keep it as small as possible. Okay, so that's mostly it for my workflow for exporting from Blender to After Effects to uploading. Let me know in the comments if you learned anything new or if there's anything else you struggle with, so maybe I can help you or make another video. So yeah, see you in the next one.